No one expected what came next. In the shadowy silence of a Windsor study, King Charles revealed a secret that shattered assumptions and ignited royal tensions. A royal sanctuary beloved by monarchs and sacred to Queen Elizabeth herself was not left to William, nor to the crown, but to Prince George. And not just any estate Balmoral, her Highland refuge. The admission left William speechless and the monarchy on edge. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a quiet conversation between father and son suddenly became a confession that rewrote the rules of inheritance and loyalty. Charles did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the cold weight of history, of duty, and of a promise once whispered by a mother who ruled longer than any monarch before her. Balmoral, he explained, was never intended for the heir. It had been marked, privately and deliberately, for George. In that moment, the air seemed to tighten. William heard the words, but he could not accept the meaning. The estate that symbolized strength, privacy, retreat and power had bypassed him completely. Shock cracked into disbelief, and disbelief slowly hardened into something darker, the feeling of being quietly sidelined by those he trusted most. He tried to understand how the Queen, with all her foresight, could overlook the son destined for the throne. But behind that decision lay years of memories, conversations, and silent judgments. Balmoral had always been mythic inside the royal story, almost sacred ground where monarchs retreated to think, to plan, and to endure. And it was there, in those final summers, that she spent long private hours with George, time that now seemed far more intentional than innocent. Was this pure affection, or an unseen preparation? Was George chosen, or subtly shaped? Charles admitted that even he had not known the full extent of the Queen's wish until her papers were laid before him. Bound by law, bound by legacy, and bound by respect, he carried the burden of a decision that pleased no one. He felt the pull between fatherhood and kingship, aware that honoring his mother meant wounding his son. And as William struggled to steady himself, another realization struck. George had no idea. The child at the heart of this storm remained untouched by the turmoil swirling around his name, at least for now. Yet rumors had already begun forming in the shadows of memory. Staff recalled moments, glances, quiet talks by fireplaces, gentle words spoken only to George. The Queen had seen something, believed something, and acted on it. Whether prophetic or reckless, her choice reopened old wounds about favoritism, destiny, and control, leaving William to question not just the will, but his place in the future she envisioned. But how could such a seismic inheritance pass over the direct heir? The answer lies not just in bloodlines, but in bonds and a legacy forged in secret. As courtiers planned barbecues and photographers lingered by the gates, no one knew what was truly unfolding inside Balmoral's stone walls. Queen Elizabeth's final summer wasn't just a retreat, it was a reckoning. And young Prince George, with eyes wide and innocent, was at the center of it all. She had invited him deliberately, quietly, and without William or Catherine at his side. To the outside world, it looked like a sweet gesture from a grandmother who cherished time with her grandson. But beneath that gentle image lay intent, a decision shaped over years of reflection, regret, and calculation. She wanted him alone. She wanted him listening. She wanted him understanding things no child should ever be asked to carry, and yet she believed he would someday need to. Those days seemed simple. Long talks, soft voices, words chosen carefully. There were walks where they disappeared from watchful ears, conversations spoken slowly and deliberately, conversations no one overheard, conversations that would never be repeated but would echo across time. Staff noted the pattern. George beside her, her hand lightly guiding his. Not lectures, not commands, lessons wrapped as stories, warnings disguised as memories. She was not preparing him for play, she was preparing him for burden. And already he listened in a way that unsettled those who noticed. Whispers later surfaced about a journal entry, one she wrote when the nights felt heavier than usual. In it, at least according to those who claimed to have seen it, she described him simply as the boy who listens. Not the boy who laughs, not the boy who runs, the boy who listens. The phrase carried weight. It suggested recognition, it hinted at expectation. And it revealed something else. She believed he would carry the crown differently, perhaps more quietly, perhaps more obediently, perhaps more controlled than those before him. Her thoughts returned often to her own father, George VI, the reluctant sovereign who bore unimaginable strain, yet never surrendered his calm dignity. In George she saw the same quiet resolve, the same steady patience, the same stillness that made others lean in. This resemblance haunted her. It also comforted her. It convinced her that the future should rest not only on the shoulders of those next in line, but upon the one she believed destiny had whispered toward. Not everyone remained entirely ignorant of what she was doing. Fragments of conversations slipped through closed doors. Staff caught pieces talk of heritage, obligation, sacrifice, legacy. They didn't hear instructions about playrooms or tutors. They heard words aboo: tea duty, guardianship, endurance. And though no one dared question her directly, unease began to move among those who sensed that something irreversible was forming. Those weeks would later be remembered not as sentimental family time, but as the quiet forging of a plan that would alter every expectation, unsettle loyalties, and rewrite inheritance itself. As summer faded into mist, the Queen's intentions crystallized secrets etched into her will, now unsealed by the crown's reluctant keeper. Imagine being king and father, and being forced to choose which role to honor first. Charles had always envisioned William as the steward of Balmoral, but a sealed letter from his late mother shattered that plan, dragging him into a crisis that could splinter the future of the monarchy itself. The moment the contents of that letter met his eyes, the world shifted beneath his feet. It was more than ink and royal wax, it was a reckoning from beyond the grave. Elizabeth had not only made a private decision, she had left Charles with an impossible task: either obey her dying wish or defy the royal hierarchy he was now sworn to uphold. For weeks, he lived with the weight of that letter buried inside him, saying nothing, delaying the inevitable, hoping perhaps that clarity might come. It didn't. Every conversation with William became more difficult, every silence more damning. Charles found himself pacing through familiar halls, rehearsing answers he never gave. Camilla watched him unravel slowly, watched the tension carve itself into his face. One night, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps to feel less alone in the burden, he finally confessed. She bypassed the air for the hope, he told her, voice tight, almost trembling. Those 7 words echoed like a riddle wrapped in heartbreak. The hope, of course, was George. Not the next king, but the one after. A symbol of a future untainted. The scars of the past. For Charles, it felt like history repeating itself, once again being passed over for someone else's ideal. He remembered his own years in waiting, the distance between him and the Queen, the quiet disappointment that seemed to settle in every royal interaction. And now, decades later, the same pattern emerged. Balmoral, that sacred Highland refuge, was being pulled from his son's grasp by the hands of a boy barely aware of what had been done. The emotional parallels struck cruelly. Had Elizabeth seen George as the monarch Charles never became? Was this her final unspoken judgment? And if so, how could he, as king, carry it forward without betraying his own blood? Legal counsel was summoned discreetly. Hidden meetings, sealed reports, whispered confirmations. Could a sovereign truly enforce the Queen's posthumous request without destabilizing the perception of William as future king? Could the public handle such a move? Would the crown fracture from within? And yet, all roads led to one conclusion: the Queen's clause was legally sound and symbolically irreversible. Balmoral was not to be shared. It was to belong solely to George. William sensed the growing distance. He saw the way Charles's eyes avoided his. He felt the betrayal forming long before it was spoken. What began as confusion curdled into resentment. And still, Charles said nothing. Not yet. He was buying time he no longer had. Each day of silence was a day closer to detonation. As the pressure built, Charles knew he couldn't hide the truth much longer, especially not from the son who expected to inherit it all. He was never supposed to be blindsided. Prince William, groomed for decades as the future king, suddenly found himself cut out of one of the monarchy's most symbolic estates. And what began as stunned silence erupted into thunderous confrontation behind closed palace doors. Revelation didn't come gently. It crashed into him like betrayal wrapped in ceremonial language, and all the years of loyalty, preparation, obedience, all of it felt mocked in a single stroke. Balmoral was not just land, it was memory, it was sanctuary, it was where monarchs mourned, healed, planned and survived. And to learn it had been promised to his son while bypassing him entirely ignited something fierce and wounded inside him. When he finally confronted Charles, the words tore out before restraint could catch them. You chose your grandson over your son. The statement wasn't anger alone, it was grief. It was the echo of a lifetime of sacrifice suddenly appearing pointless. Charles tried explaining legacy, duty, the Queen's final wish, but explanation sounded like excuse, and excuse sounded like dismissal. Catherine, caught in the middle, tried to soften the edges, speaking quietly, urging both men to breathe, to think, to remember that their family came before property, yet even she could not erase the sting of what had been done. Privately, she felt the shock as deeply as William, though she hid it under composure. In William's mind, shadows of Diana resurfaced the secrecy, the prioritizing of image over truth, the sense that personal cost was always demanded without question. Old wounds reopened, and suddenly this wasn't about an estate anymore. It was about worth, about trust, about whether he had ever truly been seen. Staff whispered later about raised voices echoing late into the night, about doors closed too abruptly, about footsteps pacing halls until dawn. Rumors traveled fast, though no one dared speak openly. And when the family stepped out for public engagements, smiles stiffened into masks, eyes cold, postures rigid. The air around them carried tension so thick that even bystanders sensed something had broken. William didn't storm out. He didn't collapse. Instead, he grew quiet, dangerously quiet, the kind of silence that signals fracture beneath the surface. And as days slipped forward, and rehearsed gestures continued, the truth lingered unresolved between father and son, forcing every interaction to feel like negotiation rather than love. But even as emotions raged, the world outside Balmoral remained blissfully unaware until one detail changed everything. Among layers of official paperwork, typed legalese and royal protocol, one handwritten clause surfaced like a thunderclap. Queen Elizabeth II, in her own script, detailed her wish. Balmoral was to pass directly to George, not William, not Charles, not the crown. Her ink was clear. Her choice was final. The revelation came not from a press statement, not from a formal announcement, but from the hushed voice of a private secretary who had discovered the clause tucked into a folder marked for personal instruction. It was unmistakably hers, her handwriting, her tone, her resolve. A single line scrawled beneath the typed will pierced the heart of tradition. To the young George, may this place shield and shape him. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. A final act of monarchy from a sovereign who had rarely let sentiment override structure until now. Legal advisors moved swiftly and in near silence, analyzing every word for ambiguity and loophole. They found none. It was valid, executable, and binding. Charles, cornered by legacy and legality, had no choice. Balmoral was no longer his to divide. He was now the executor of a vision he hadn't written, and the keeper of a storm it had unleashed. The royal household tried to keep the detail contained, releasing a carefully redacted summary to the public. But redactions only fueled speculation. What was being hidden? Why did George's name appear in private documents never meant for the press? Why had William's name not been there at all? Then the leak came. Not from Buckingham, but from an inner circle of legal aides whose silence cracked under pressure. Reporters received excerpts of the Queen's handwritten clause, and overnight, the press turned a private decision into a public reckoning. Headlines screamed betrayal, foresight, favoritism. Royal commentators debated the meaning of a monarch bypassing her direct heirs. And amidst the chaos, one detail took center stage. George had spent more time at Balmoral in the Queen's final years than anyone had realized. Hidden in plain sight, photos were unearthed. Records confirmed that while William and Catherine had returned to London for engagements, George had stayed behind with his great-grandmother. Now, what had once been framed as a sweet generational bond took on a more calculated hue. Had Elizabeth been preparing him all along? Had she seen something in George that the rest of the family had missed or refused to admit? The narrative shifted dramatically. This wasn't about real estate. This was about royal trajectory, about power, foresight, and a boy being quietly shaped in the shadow of a throne. As headlines blared and public intrigue soared, attention turned to the young prince himself. What did George know, and what would he become? He was barely 10, but his world had shifted forever. Prince George, unaware of the storm he stood in the center of, now faced the weight of a kingdom's legacy and the resentment of the man who would be king. At first it came in fragments, muted conversations in hallways, glances exchanged between adults, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. The change wasn't explained to him, not directly, but children feel what they aren't told, and George, more perceptive than most gave him credit for, began to sense something was different. Whispers reached him, not words, but meanings. He heard his name spoken with tones that weren't warm. He saw how his father would pause before answering his questions. He felt the silence between moments where comfort used to live. Catherine watched it unfold with a quiet ache in her chest. A mother's instinct told her the cost of legacy was already too high. She had not asked for her son to be chosen. She had not planned this detour in their lives. And yet now she found herself watching her child caught in a current he never asked to navigate. She tried to protect him, shielding him from tension in the air, but the divide between past and future had already cracked open. And in that chasm George stood alone, praised by some, pitied by others, envied by a few. But none of it made sense to him. All he knew was that something once stable had become uncertain, and it revolved around him. The irony of being chosen over his father was not lost on those who understood royal dynamics. It wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility that none could explain to a child. And yet the preparations had begun. Tutors were brought in, not with fanfare, but with discretion. Mentors arrived under the guise of etiquette lessons, history studies, and philosophical reflection. But the true purpose was clear: to shape him into something more than a future monarch, to shape him into a symbol, a vessel for his great-grandmother's last, unshakable will. The monarchy wasn't just giving him a property, it was giving him a shadow to carry, and a future he didn't yet know how to face. Those close to him noticed a shift. George, once carefree in rare moments of privacy, grew quieter, more observant. Cameras caught glimpses the public didn't immediately interpret, moments where his expression seemed older than his years, where his posture mirrored something far heavier than childhood. One image, in particular, would become iconic: George standing at the gates of Balmoral, hands tucked behind his back, gazing into the distance. Alone. Not as a boy playing on holiday, but as someone aware he had become a figure the world now watched. And yet he said nothing. He didn't push back. He didn't cry out. He simply listened, just as the Queen had once described him, the boy who listens. But while one young prince tried to understand the legacy left to him, another figure, Camilla, was quietly building her countermove. She wasn't mentioned in the will, not even once. For Queen Camilla, Balmoral had always been a battlefield of memory and exclusion. But this latest move wasn't just about real estate, it was about power. And Camilla never placed to lose. The silence of her name in the Queen's final testament struck deeper than any public slight. To be passed over so deliberately, so completely, reignited every unspoken resentment that had followed her ascent. She had endured decades of scrutiny, clawed her way into a place at the royal table, and finally emerged as Queen Consort, only to be erased at the moment it counted most. The Queen's affection had never fully reached her, but this was something colder. This was a statement, a final punctuation mark on a long, complicated relationship. And Camilla read it for what it was: a warning and a challenge. She responded not with tears, but with tactics. Quiet ones, deliberate ones. If the Queen had chosen George, then Camilla would shape him. She began pushing, softly at first, for proximity, proposals of involvement in his education, suggestions that she help coordinate his charitable introductions. On the surface it appeared nurturing, familial even, but beneath it was strategy, influence, control. If she couldn't undo the Queen's decision, she would at least ensure it didn't unfold without her fingerprints. Select aides were summoned. Not many, just the loyal few. Conversati. Ons unfolded behind mahogany doors and under the protection of private courtyards. Meetings not recorded in public schedules, but whose consequences would soon ripple far beyond what anyone expected. Charles, already buckling under the pressure of his mother's final command and his son's spiraling resentment, now found himself trapped in yet another vice. Camilla demanded to be heard. William expected to be protected. George remained the lightning rod between them. Every dinner, every corridor, every formal function became a minefield. And while Charles clung to the remnants of royal order, Camilla quietly bent the rules behind him. Then came the leak. Subtle at first, a detail not included in the official press release, then a direct quote from a senior source suggesting George had always been favoured. The language was careful, too careful, and all fingers pointed inward. Was it Camilla, someone acting on her behalf? No one could prove it, but the timing was no coincidence. Public speculation exploded, and suddenly Balmoral was not just a story of inheritance, it was a symbol of division. Questions swirled about Catherine's place, about William's authority, about George's role in a monarchy increasingly shaped by invisible hands. And through it all, Camilla began retreating from view. Public appearances grew fewer, engagements postponed. Official explanations cited fatigue. But insiders whispered something else. This was not withdrawal, it was recalibration. Camilla wasn't vanishing, she was regrouping. And just as palace politics simmered toward boiling, Balmoral's ancient chapel revealed one final secret from the Queen herself. Tucked behind an old library wall inside Balmoral lay a sealed room untouched for decades. Only one person had the key, and as it opened for the first time since the Queen's death, its contents sent ripples through royal history and straight into young George's destiny. It had been known only by a few trusted aides, a single archivist, and Elizabeth herself. She called it the Quiet Room, not for its silence, but for what it carried. Echoes of a life spent in preparation, in war, in secrecy, and in solitude. The discovery was not part of any grand tour. It happened during a private inspection following the Queen's funeral, when a key left behind in a velvet pouch bore a tag with no explanation. Curiosity led to the forgotten corner of the estate, and behind a panelled wall, the lock turned. Inside, time stood still. Dust veiled the shelves, but what lay beneath it was preserved like relics of a hidden shrine. Journals written in the Queen's youth chronicled her days not as a sovereign, but as a daughter, a sister, and a girl navigating the burden of future royalty. There were wartime letters, some to her parents, some to herself, full of fear, longing, and conviction. Among them sat black and white portraits of King George VI, positioned deliberately, as if watching. But what broke the silence was a small box resting on an aged writing desk, sealed in thick red wax stamped with the royal crest. It bore one name. George. William and Catherine stood still as the seal cracked. Inside was a handwritten letter, not ceremonial, not regal, personal, direct. The Queen's words to her great-grandson were simple yet thunderous in meaning. She spoke of the land, of Balmoral, not as an estate, but as a soul of the monarchy. She described how it had protected her, shaped her strength, offered solace when the world felt unbearable. And now, she wrote, it was his. May you guard this land as it guarded me, she ended. That line would etch itself into the collective memory of those who read it. Beside the letter were 3 items: a worn silver brooch she had worn as a child, a small photo of her with her father taken in the last days before his death, and a leather-bound book of prayers with a pressed thistle between its pages. Each piece told a story without needing explanation. For Catherine, the symbolism struck like a wave. She wept not for power, but for the overwhelming knowledge that her son had been chosen for something he could not yet understand. William remained speechless, torn between reverence and regret, the finality of the Queen's intentions now too clear to ignore. And George, holding the letter with hands too young to carry its weight, asked only one question. Did she know I would come here alone? That question lingered in the room, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Even as the past whispered its blessing, the future loomed with tension, and one final confrontation would decide the fate of the royal household. It was meant to be a private moment, but nothing stays hidden within palace walls. When William and Charles faced off in a final reckoning over Balmoral, the monarchy itself trembled. What would prevail, tradition, blood, or a queen's unwavering will? The confrontation wasn't scheduled, nor was it calm. William had reached a point beyond decorum, beyond diplomacy. His voice carried the strain of years built upon expectation, now crumbling beneath the weight of a decision that bypassed him entirely. "Reverse it before it's too late," he said, not as a threat, but on pleading with his father. There was desperation in his tone, not just for himself, but for the image of a monarchy that no longer felt intact. His demand wasn't for power, it was for clarity, for dignity, for something that felt just. Charles stood his ground, but not without cost. Tears welled, not from defiance, but from exhaustion. He clutched the final letter. His mother had left him a note tucked beneath legal documents, written in her firm, unmistakable hand. "If you love them," she had written, "you must trust the future more than you fear it." It was her final instruction, not just to honor her will, but to believe in the boy she had chosen. And now that choice had split the family down its spine. He looked at William not as a monarch, but as a father racked with guilt. And still, he refused. Not out of pride, but out of obligation. The room fell into a suffocating silence until Catherine spoke. Her voice was soft, but it broke through like a bell. "This cannot destroy us," she said, the weight of her own anguish barely restrained. "George will need all of us, not a kingdom built on bitterness." Her words didn't plead. They reminded that this wasn't just about land or even legacy. This was about a child watching a family unravel because of a decision he never made. And at that very moment, George entered the room. He hadn't been summoned. He hadn't been told. But somehow he knew. He stood silently, eyes wide, the tension thick enough to be felt even by him. No one spoke. No one moved. It was the image of a dynasty caught between past and future, kings and children, duty and inheritance. George didn't ask questions. He simply looked at his father, then his grandfather, and waited for someone to say what needed to be said. In the hours that followed, a reluctant consensus formed. The Queen's will would be honoured. Balmoral would pass to George, but only UPO. Charles's death, and it would be held in trust until then. A public statement followed days later, carefully worded, meticulously timed. The backlash was measured. The headlines were fierce but faded. Yet within the palace, the ripples endured. The monarchy had made a choice not just to preserve a decision, but to accept that destiny sometimes speaks louder than tradition. And so the Queen's sanctuary passed not with a crown, but with conviction, one quiet decision echoing into generations yet to come. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.